Chapter 16 Anger in the Bar. Few hours ago, after Neil left the restaurant where he'd had to control his temper and irritation to stay in place even though the girl was annoying the crap out of him, his phone rang in his pocket. He picked up the call and growled at the other person on the other side. "If you are calling to also annoy the fuck out of me, Liam, then you picked the wrong time to call." Whoa, relax, man. Who's the lucky person who got on your good side today? Liam laughed, trying to humor his friend. Was it the beauty you're assigned to supervise? I'm hanging up the damn call if you don't start explaining why you called me when you know you aren't supposed to when I am still being Leo Bennett. He cut in sharply, but Liam wasn't a bit offended as he was already used to his friend's temper. Instead, he went straight to the point of why he'd called. "All right, come down to the Red House. We've caught one of the rats," said Liam. Understanding what he meant, Neil hung up the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and left in the car he used when he was posing to be Leo Bennett. In 5 minutes, Neil had sped the black Ferrari into a deserted building in downtown Zen City. He exited the car and slammed the door behind him before walking into the building in long strides. His expression was devoid of any emotions, his gray eyes were as fierce and sharp as a blade. He walked down the dark, narrowed corridors that led to an underground dungeon. Despite the darkness, Neil navigated his way through the corridors until he arrived down in a damp, gloomy dungeon that smelled of dried blood and tortured flesh. If a normal person walked into such a place, they'd have passed out just from the unforgiving stench of tormented flesh. However, Neil Wayner walked deeper into it like he was walking into a fast food restaurant. Even before he arrived at the inner part of the dungeon, he could already hear the loud cries of the tormented criminal. When he arrived there, he was greeted by 5 soldiers, who were disguised as normal everyday men. "General Wayner," they saluted him to show their respect for their senior. Neil acknowledged their greetings with a curt nod and walked past them. He stepped into the cell room where Liam was torturing a man and causing him to cry like an animal being slaughtered. Seeing Neil, Liam grinned as if he hadn't just been using a hot iron to decorate the tortured man's body. "You arrived quicker than I expected, Neil," Liam remarked with a side-lope smirk. "Look who we've caught, the bastard supplying the bombs to the terrorists in Lemuria. I have been trying to get a confession from him about their boss in charge of the shipments, but it seems my pretty decoration on his body isn't enough for him to start talking." Neil glanced at the man tied to the electric iron chair. Decoration was an understatement of what was done to his body. However, this was just the beginning if he wouldn't confess. Because whenever Neil Wayner got involved, things got messier. "When you caught him, were there any signs he is one of Doc Kroll's lackeys?" Neil questioned calmly as he began to fold his shirt sleeve to his elbow, revealing his toned, veined, inked forearms. "Not a trace. And now it's making me doubt if Doc Kroll is really involved with supplying the weapons to the terrorists in Lemuria," Liam replied as he stepped back to give Neil access to the tortured man. Neil picked up a knife out of the many weapons laying on the table and looked at the frightened man. "I will make your death less painful if you tell me who you work for." He negotiated calmly as if his words would encourage the man to speak. Neil had dealt with many people like this. If they didn't speak even after the torture had gone as far as losing their limbs, then nothing would ever make them speak. However, he always had his way of getting the truth out of them somehow, even though not the entire truth. The man in question just continued to stare at Neil with one of his good eyes, as his other eye was so swollen it looked as if a boiled egg had been forced into the socket. "Go fuck yourself," he spat angrily at Neil's clean, shiny shoe. Neil lost his temper and slammed his fist into the man's jaw. A cracking sound was heard from the impact of the punch. The man fell backward along with the electric chair, but Neil grabbed him by his hair and lifted him back up with the chair. Through gritted teeth, he said, "I will fuck you up first." Saying that, he used the knife to cut off the man's lips. The cell room was filled with his loud, animalistic cries as his lips oozed out blood. Neil knelt down before him. He made sure his eyes were locked with the man as he calmly questioned, "Are you working for yourself or do you have a boss?" The man's eyes looked frighteningly at Neil without replying. Neil asked another question. "What is Doc Kroll's connection with Ivy Grove Institute? What do you ship from the school?" He raised his knife and positioned it close to the man's eyes. "Don't waste my time, speak." The man jolted in fright as the knife was now poised against his manhood. He started to cry again. But this time he spoke. I swear to the Lord, I don't know anything about the person I am working for. I have never met him before, but I know that someone in the university is the second in command to my boss. Do you know his name? Neil asked, but the man quickly shook his head. I don't know who he is. I just know he is there. Please, let me go. I will repent my sins and be a good citizen to my country. He pleaded desperately. I have already promised to make your death less painful if you speak. Saying that, Neil finished the man up without giving him the chance to even feel the pain of his death. Wow, that was a clean cut, Liam remarked from the side as he looked down at the bloody body on the ground. I guess we are still back to level 1 with no clues of where Doc Kroll is hiding and who the helper is in Ivy Grove Institution, said Liam. Liam's remarks only irked Neil's mood as it reminded him of his lack of progress in his mission. He was seething with anger as he stormed out of the dungeon and into the chilly night with Liam trailing behind him. Neil leaned against his car and took out a cigarette from his pocket, his fingers moving with a controlled intensity as the match flared to life, casting a fleeting glow on his stern features. He inhaled deeply, the cigarette light cast a crimson glow on his face as he exhaled a stream of smoke into the night air. Liam, sensing the storm brewing within Neil, cautiously approached. Attempting to break the tension, he cracked a joke. Don't be bitter, man. You will soon find another prey to lead you to the bottom of this. Neil's frigid stare silenced Liam's any attempt at levity. The smoke curled around Neil like a shroud as he spoke, his voice cold and emotionless. You have no idea how much this damn mission means to me, Liam, Neil murmured, his gray eyes reflecting a steely determination. The night breeze seemed to carry away any warmth from his words. You have no idea how much I've been waiting for the day I would get to have the leader of Doc Kroll in custody. I want him so bad I'll turn Zen City upside down to find him. The silence that followed hung heavy, disturbed only by the distant howl of the wind. Neil's demeanor remained as cold as the night that surrounded them. 15 years ago, he had sworn to avenge the man responsible for his parents' death. And now, 15 years later, that man was also responsible for millions of lives across the world. I need some fresh air. Notify General David about the event. Give me the key to your bike, said Neil to his friend as he threw away the half-cigarette. Liam didn't joke about anything again, knowing any topic about Doc Kroll was something sensitive to his friend. He fished out the motorcycle keys from his pocket and threw them towards Neil. Neil swiftly caught the key in his hand and headed towards the black motorcycle parked at the side of the building. He wanted to get away from everything. He wanted to forget his mission and drown himself in cups until he could no longer think of those haunting memories that resurfaced every time Doc Kroll's name was mentioned. He didn't bother to even put on his helmet as he kicked the motorcycle to life and rode off at full speed that left a dent mark on the ground of the place where the bike had been parked. Despite the harsh night breeze blowing over his face, Neil did not slow down until he reached the bar where he planned to drown himself until he could no longer think of anything else tonight. Fuck his mission and to hell with the protocols of not drinking when in disguise, Neil thought as he approached the entrance of the bar. However, before he could even reach the threshold, he heard a familiar, soothing melody he hadn't heard in 15 years. But when he saw the person singing and playing the song, he froze for a moment. What the hell was she doing in such a place? There on the bar performance stage, Set Mai, whatever her name, was singing the only song he'd ever liked in his entire life. Instead of turning on his heels and leaving the bar so he wouldn't blow off his disguise as a gentlemanly professor, he found himself walking into the bar and looking at her sing on the stage. She looked towards him and their eyes locked for a moment before she looked away. Neil felt himself being drawn to the melody and the familiar lyrics. You can't miss what you never had. I never knew the touch of love, I will never miss the caresses of it, but I always long for it. Look, Xavier, I can sing the song as you taught me, said a small voice from his distant memories. The memories he so much wanted to bury away and forget they ever took place were suddenly coming back to him as he listened to that familiar song. As Neil was lost in the soothing melody of her voice and the guitar, he heard the man beside him laugh. Oh, I will certainly make her feel the touch and caresses of my dick tonight. Neil suddenly felt disgusted by the man who dared misinterpret the meaning of his favorite song. And without hesitation, he swirled around and caught the man by his collar. How about I make you shove your fat dick down your throat? Neil repeatedly slammed his fists onto the man's face until his nose cracked and he fell limp to the ground. Chapter 17. Where did you learn to play that song? Mia was astonished to see her professor hitting the pervert. She didn't even realize she had stopped playing and had stood up from her performance seat to watch as her professor was pulled out of the bar after he'd knocked the other man unconscious. What was he doing in a place like this, not to mention fighting? Mia thought to herself. She had never seen or heard any professors from Ivy Grove Institute get involved in any fight or visit a bar. The school carried themselves high enough not to draw any bad news in Zen City. All the professors were sure to go under background checks and be on their best behavior before they were assigned any position in the school. But here was their new professor knocking someone unconscious in a downtown bar like a Red Bull. As Mia was staring at the exit of the bar where Mr. Bennett had been chased out, she was snapped back to her senses by the bar manager's voice. "Miss, I am sorry but you have to leave. It was your fault that savage man knocked down my best customer," he said displeasingly. He had heard from the friends of the man knocked unconscious that the savage man had hit the other man because he'd commented on the girl singing on the stage. So it meant they knew each other. Mia was taken aback by his words. "What about the money we agreed on a while ago?" she questioned. "You have to pay me before chasing me away. Besides, I didn't ask that man to knock your customer unconscious." I don't care, miss. Take yourself and your guitar and get the hell out of my bar before I tell my men to throw you out," he rebuked sternly. Mia was going to argue her right to be paid, but when she noticed some men in black suits walking towards her, she quickly gave up any idea of argument. However, she couldn't help but curse Mr. Bennett for the bad luck he was bringing to her life. First, he would be the cause of her getting bad grades in school for not showing up to supervise her assignments, and now he was the reason she was being chased out when she needed that money to support her mother financially. Mia walked out of the bar, slipping her guitar case behind her back. As she was walking down the road that would lead to the bus station, her soul almost jumped out of her body when a voice suddenly spoke from the side of the road. "Where did you learn to play that song?" came Neil's voice from the side. He was sitting casually on a short staircase that led to a closed bookstore. As it was already late at night, all the shops and stores around the road were closed, and the lights on the street were dim. The dim light illuminated his emotionless features as he sat there with his long legs spread apart, his elbow resting on each of his knees. Between the fingers of his left hand was a burning cigarette. His black attire made him look like a leopard waiting for its prey to pass by. He locked Mia in place with his piercing gaze. She suddenly felt a chill down her spine from the way he was looking at her. She didn't even realize he had asked her a question earlier until he'd repeated himself. "Are you deaf or just acting deaf to make me repeat myself?" I said, "Where did you learn to play like that?" he repeated, his voice betraying his growing irritation. Mia suddenly felt she was short of words to reply. She wasn't expecting him to wait here for her to pass just to ask such a question. Despite her reluctance to speak with him after what he'd done, she cleared her throat. "I didn't learn it from anyone. I just know how to play it somehow," she answered honestly. She had naturally found out she could play the music, and whenever she told anyone who asked her about how she'd learned it, they would always react in surprise or even call her a liar. However, if the man before her was surprised or took her for a liar, he didn't show it. He just continued to regard her with those burning eyes of his. For a moment, Mia almost thought he hadn't heard her words and was going to repeat it when he suddenly opened his mouth and said the last thing she'd expect him to say. "Come sit here and play the song for me." He patted the space beside him on the staircase. Mia didn't move nor attempt to sit beside him. She would be out of her mind to sit out here by this time of the night with a man who she was starting to become wary of after everything she'd noticed about him. First, it was his ominous snake tattoos that she'd noticed the other day, and tonight she'd witnessed him knock a man unconscious for whatever reason. Last but not least, he was smoking and sitting outside like a creep, asking her to play him a song. "I am sorry, sir, but Mia began to give her excuse for why she couldn't sit out here with him, when he blankly said, "I wasn't asking you to play me the song." Mia started to sigh in relief, but his next words knocked the breath out of her. "I was commanding you to come sit here and play me the song," he remarked nonchalantly, but his tone was frigid and left no room for her to dare refuse him. Mia reluctantly dragged her feet to move towards him, and when she stood before him, he moved over to make more room for her to sit on the staircase. She removed her guitar case and brought it out. It would be a big fat lie if she said she wasn't nervous sitting beside him. Even her movement became clumsy as she could feel his unwavering gaze following her every movement. Because of her momentary trembling hands, she mistakenly used the guitar's fretboard to hit hard against his knee when she tried to find a comfortable position on the staircase. I hate clumsy people. Start playing, he hissed as he moved his knee from her guitar's reach. Mia glared at him as she wanted to say, "Wasn't it your fault I was being clumsy?" But then she didn't dare speak upon meeting his no-nonsense, stern gray eyes. The dim light of the street only made him appear sinister. She gulped down her saliva and looked down at her guitar. She couldn't help but wonder why he was so interested in hearing her play that song when he didn't look the kind to listen to music. She cleared her throat and started to move her long, slender fingers across the fretboard of her guitar. She closed her eyes and began to sing along with the tone she made. This song was a song that had been carved into her heart for as long as she could remember. And whenever she sang it, all her worries and life burdens seemed to disappear. And just like every time, as she was singing it now, she was so immersed in the song she didn't notice the expression of the man sitting beside her. Neil stared at her side profile in what seemed to look like a disbelieving expression. As the soothing melody seeped into his mind and soul, he didn't realize the cigarette between his fingers had burned to the end until it burned him. He muttered a curse and flung it away. "Look, now that I can play the song, I will play it for you every time you want to hear it to sleep like your mama does," said a small voice from the past memories he'd buried along with his parents' death. After the incident years ago that stripped him of his happy life with his family, Neil had hated music and any instruments that would remind him of his past and the memories that were buried with them. However, tonight when he heard this girl sing on that performance stage, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt for 15 years. He realized he might hate every song on earth, but not this one. Longing. Longing is a song that would forever be his favorite on earth, because it held those bitter and beautiful memories of his past. As Mia finished playing the song, she opened her eyes and glanced at the man, who had been quietly listening to her sing beside her. He wasn't looking at her now but staring blankly at the flickering lamppost on the street. Mia had heard from a lot of people that this song always brought them to tears as it held a deeper meaning and emotions. It seemed even her frosty professor was touched by it. She gazed at his side profile for a while before realizing she had to return home before her mother realized she wasn't at home. She brought out her phone and glanced at the time. She was astonished to realize it was already 11:50 p.m. "Shoot! I have to leave, Mr. Bennett." She hurriedly placed her guitar back inside the case and stood up. "Though I would have loved to sit and pour out my disappointment in you for ditching me in your office today, but I have to get home before my mother or my neighbors realize I went out at this time of the night. Good night." Mia hurriedly left the place even before Neil could reply. He watched her slender back disappear into the night with an unfathomable expression in his eyes. Chapter 18. Get On. Mia walked along the quiet night streets alone. She was clutching tightly to her guitar case as she hurried to catch a taxi, even though it would cause her to spend the last money in her pocket. Bus rides were cheaper, but unfortunately, she had stayed out too long to catch any buses. As Mia arrived at the main road where she was expecting to find a taxi, she was disappointed to find the road quiet and deserted. She had never stayed out this long in her entire life. Her mother always made sure she was escorted by Owen, and if she were to go out at night, the latest she'd stayed out with Owen was 10 p.m. However, checking the time on her phone, she realized it was already 12:04 a.m. Why was she going through so much bad luck today? The universe seemed to be against her and all of her actions. How was she going to get home at this time of the night alone? Whispering Way Street is 2 miles away from here. She couldn't possibly walk such a distance at this time. However, she had no choice. It was better than standing around idly. Mia started to walk down the quiet road while cursing her bad luck, as well as Mr. Bennett, who had made her stay and sing him a song. She could hear the distant barking of dogs and the crickets singing in the night. Her heart was hanging on her sleeve with every moment that ticked off. As she continued walking hurriedly down the dimly lit road, praying for a cab to pass by, she suddenly heard some movements from a dark alleyway on the side. She increased her pace as the movements turned out to be footsteps. She was well aware of the rumors that said this part of the city was filled with armed robbers and rapists. The last thing she wanted was to get robbed of her only treasured guitar or get raped by some disgusting men. However, it seemed her luck was indeed bad, because right in front of her, 2 men jumped out from who knows where and blocked her path. "Oh, look what we have here. A beautiful lone woman in the middle of the night," remarked one of the men who had jumped to block her path. Mia would have considered putting her martial arts training to the test if 4 more men hadn't suddenly appeared from the dark alleyway to join the 2. Mia began to back away slowly as they advanced on her. To mask her fear, she forced a smile and said, Could you be kind enough to point me to a place where I can get a ride home, gentlemen? As you can see, I can't seem to find a cab to get home." The men burst into laughter. "Sure, we will point you in the right direction where you will climax 8 times after we are done with you, sweetheart," said the bulky, fat man who seemed to be the leader of the gang. Mia felt her skin crawl in disgust at the man's words. She immediately understood these weren't thieves but rapists, who lurk in the dark to wait for their victims. From the stench of alcohol that swirled towards her nose, it was obvious they had been drinking in the dark alleyway, waiting for their prey, and she ended up being the most vulnerable prey out in the middle of the night. "You don't want to touch me, gentlemen. I am like a forbidden fruit to any male. I have a disease that kills." She lied to make them change their minds about what they planned to do to her. Screaming bloody murder wasn't an option because no one would be here to help her on such a deserted road. "You've got AIDS? You think we don't know you're lying to get off? Let me tell you, sweetie, even if you have a disease worse than AIDS, it won't stop me from having you. I haven't had a woman in forever, because I can't afford a prostitute, but God sent you to us. We can't disappoint him by letting you go untouched," said the gang leader, who was already trying to remove his belt. Mia decided to turn on her heels and run for her life, but the moment she turned, she heard him order his lackeys to get her. She hadn't even gotten far before she was pulled by her jacket. Her guitar case fell to the ground as 2 of the men yanked her back. She tried to use the technique of her martial arts training to kick one of the men on his face, but the others rushed to restrain her movements by pinning her to the damp, cold ground of the stone road. At this point, Mia regretted ever coming out to work for money to assist her mother. She hadn't only been chased out of the bar without being paid, but now she would be raped by disgusting men, who smelled like they hadn't showered in a year. She felt like throwing up as they loomed over her. 2 of them were pinning her legs down while another was pinning her hands above her head. She tried to scream to try her luck of being heard by someone, but one of them pressed his filthy palm against her mouth to muffle her screams. As Mia's heart began to race in fear and she watched as the bulky man tore her shirt open, exposing her black bra, she felt her blood run cold. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks as she tried to struggle. She would rather die than get raped like this. When Mia thought she would be stripped of her innocence in the middle of the night, she closed her eyes and didn't even realize the black motorcycle that kicked to a stop beside them until the man above her was flung off with a hard leg kick that hit him squarely on the face. All the men holding her down quickly let go and stood up to face the intruder who dared interrupt their fun. "Who the fuck are you to interrupt us?" demanded one of the men. Neil glanced down at the girl curled up on the ground, clutching her knees to her chest. She was trembling. He then shifted his attention back to the men in front of him. His expression was icy cold, and he didn't bother speaking to them with words. Instead, he used his fists and legs. Neil kicked one man into the gutter by the roadside, while he grabbed another by the neck and slammed his head onto the stone ground. The man lay motionless, and Neil didn't even care if he was dead or unconscious. He proceeded to kick another man who approached him. In the blink of an eye, all 8 men lay groaning in pain on the ground. However, when Neil noticed the bulky man attempting to get up, he grabbed the guitar lying nearby and smashed it against the man's head. The guitar shattered along with the man's head. Once he was certain all the men were incapacitated, Neil strode towards the trembling girl on the ground. Crouching down, he avoided touching her, as he despised any physical contact with females. He gently poked her shoulder and said, "Get up, young woman. Where do you live? I will take you home," offering something he had never offered any girl before. Mia, who finally snapped back to her senses from the repeated poking on her shoulder, turned her head. In the darkness and with the man's black attire, she couldn't see his face, but she recognized his familiar cologne and immediately knew who had saved her from those lecherous men. She sat up, clutching her jacket back to her chest to cover her torn shirt. She scanned the surroundings with tear-stained cheeks. She saw all the men lying motionless on the ground. However, when her eyes fell on her shattered guitar, another tear rolled down her cheeks. She pressed a hand to her mouth. "My guitar," she cried softly. She had worked hard to buy that guitar as a teenager, but now it was ruined. Neil followed her line of sight to the guitar he'd used to smash one of the men's heads. He realized he'd ruined the instrument that had played his favorite song earlier. He suddenly felt another rush of anger. If he could turn back time and beat the living hell out of those men, he would, with the rage that surged through him from seeing the instrument he'd enjoyed earlier lying shattered on the ground. "Fuck," he cursed. His sudden curse made Mia's tear-stained eyes shift back to him. She noticed his darkened expression and thought he was mad because she was crying for her poor guitar instead of thanking him for saving her innocence. Thank you. She suddenly didn't know what to say to him more than a thank you. Instead, she stood up and put her jacket back on. She then dejectedly picked up her broken guitar. She glared at the groaning men on the ground for breaking her guitar. She even used her leg to kick at the one nearest to her, before turning and started walking away without looking at Neil. Neil was surprised. He watched the girl he had just offered a ride home walking away after kicking someone else for the guitar he'd broken. Unbelievable, he muttered. Even though she hadn't heard him offer her a ride, after what just took place, wasn't she supposed to beg him to take her home like every other girl who'd almost been attacked? It seemed Mia, or whatever her name was, wasn't the type to stay traumatized after such an incident. Actually, he would have been irritated if she had been crying and holding on to him. However, seeing her still have the courage to walk down the streets after such an incident amazed him. Neil shook his head and stood up, walking to his motorcycle. He kicked it to life. Mia, who was walking down the road while upset about her poor guitar, was surprised when a black motorcycle stopped in front of her. She looked at the rider and saw it was Mr. Bennett. She hadn't realized he'd even come on a bike when he saved her. She noticed his black hair blowing in the wind, and a tattoo peeking out of his black shirt. He looked more like a rascal than a professor. His expression was cold and lacked any emotions as he said, "Get on." Even his tone was more like an order than an offer. Mia thought about what might happen if she refused, then decided to follow his command, as she wouldn't want to be some rapist's plaything again. As she slowly walked towards the bike, he stopped her before she could climb, and handed her his helmet. Mia glanced at the helmet, then at his face. In that same commanding voice of his, he said, "Wear it." She couldn't help but wonder if he could speak without commanding. However, she still took the helmet and put it on, then clipped it. Climbing onto the bike, she contemplated whether to hold on to him. When he kicked the bike to life, Mia automatically wrapped her arms around his waist in fear of being thrown off the bike. She felt his toned abs against her arm and his sweet cologne invaded her nose as they sped away on the bike. However, throughout the entire ride, Mia held her breath as he was speeding like the hounds of hell were chasing him. Chapter 19 Participants. As Neil's motorcycle halted in front of a huge, run-down-looking apartment building in Whispering Way Street, where the girl had directed him, she climbed down his bike and meekly glanced at him. Mia was suddenly aware that she'd brought her professor to their run-down apartment building, where she'd never brought anybody from school, not even Rain. She couldn't help but feel embarrassed. However, when she glanced at Mr. Bennett, he showed no emotions. It was like he didn't care where she lived. He only stared at her with his piercing gray eyes. She was starting to wonder why he wasn't leaving and looking at her with that intense gaze of his when he said, "Helmet." Mia immediately realized she was still wearing his helmet and quickly took it off and gave it back to him while muttering a thank you. She watched as he casually wore the helmet on his head and kicked his bike. However, before he rode off, he said, "Bring your assignment to my office tomorrow." Then he sped away, leaving her standing in a daze. She stood there until she could no longer hear the loud sound of his motorcycle in the night atmosphere. However, Mia was completely unaware of someone watching her from above the window of the apartment next to theirs. She sneaked quietly back to her room and closed the door. She sighed in relief that her mother had been asleep the whole time she was absent. The poor woman had worked all day. She must be so exhausted not to hear the sound of the front door opening and closing. Mia dropped her shattered guitar on the floor. She stared at it with a remorseful expression. She regretted going out tonight. She hadn't just ruined the only thing that gave her happiness in this burdensome world, but she had almost been raped by some filthy men whose bodies hadn't touched water for ages. Recalling the event now in the comfort of her room, she felt disgusted and the urge to throw up. If it hadn't been for Mr. Bennett, only God knows what would have become of her by now on that deserted road. Mia jerked off her jacket and took off her clothes. She stepped into her bathroom and washed her body like she wanted to change her skin. By the time she was done taking a shower and wearing her pajamas, it was already 1:40 in the morning. She set an alarm and dropped exhaustedly on her bed and fell into a deep sleep within minutes. However, she was haunted by yet another one of her nightmares. There was blood covering her entire body as she sat in a corner trembling. She was crying out a name she didn't recognize and was looking at a tall figure looming over her. The figure held a gun pointing at her in the corner. Do you know what will happen to your head once I pull the trigger, little girl? Your tiny head will blow off and your brain will come oozing out of your skull, laughed the figure. And before Mia could register what was happening, there was a loud gunshot sound that made her gasp awake from her nightmare. She was panting heavily with her pajamas drenched in sweat as she glanced around her room and noticed it was morning. This wasn't her first time having such a nightmare, but it always frightened the soul out of her every time she woke up from it. Nightmare? Asked a familiar voice from the side of her bed. Mia's soul almost jumped out of her body by the sudden voice. She swirled around so suddenly she almost fell off her bed. What the hell, Owen? She exclaimed in displeasure, seeing her friend leaning against her room's wall with his hands in his pocket. Haven't I told you to stop barging into my room like a creep? She questioned, getting out of her bed to start preparing for school. However, despite Mia's displeasure of him invading her privacy, Owen didn't seem to care. He was already used to it and it was a habit that would remain. Instead of apologizing, he asked, "Where did you go last night?" Mia was picking up her towel when she heard his question. She stopped for a second. Did Owen see her leave last night? She thought to herself and picked up the towel. Nowhere, she lied and was about to walk into the bathroom, but he stepped in her way. I saw you from my room's window being dropped off by a man on a motorcycle, Mia. Don't try to shrug it off like you didn't go out at night, Owen said with a serious expression. He had woken up to have water when he heard a motorcycle halting outside. He had wondered who it was disturbing the neighborhood at that time of the night. He had even thought it was one of the girls in Whispering Way Street who would go out clubbing at night and to sell their body to earn a living. However, he was shocked to find Mia standing there with a stranger late at night. Owen had known Mia for as long as he could remember. He knew all the people she was associated with, even in her school. Though they didn't attend the same university, he knew she only had one friend and had no boyfriend, which, even if she had, he would make sure to sever the relationship like he had been doing for the past years. However, seeing the man who had dropped her off last night had not just shocked him but also surprised him. Mia glanced up at her friend's serious expression. She hadn't expected anybody to have seen her last night, but it seemed Owen had. However, the way he was taking it as if she was a child who had to tell him all of her movements and actions only irked her. Yeah, I went out last night, so what? She confronted him. Perhaps it was because she'd woken up being startled and the fact that she had slept feeling mad for her guitar, but she snapped at him in annoyance without holding back. You come to my room without my permission and you confronted me for going out last night like I am not an adult old enough to make my own decisions. What's your problem? Being my friend doesn't give you the right to always meddle with my life's affairs. Yeah, it does, Mia. I know you are old enough to do anything you like, but I am concerned about you. That's why I am here questioning you. And if you don't tell me what you were doing out last night, I swear your mother will hear of this. He threatened, his blue eyes stern. Mia knew every time he threatened to tell her mother about something she'd done, it wasn't an empty threat, he would. And if he did, her poor mother would only get worried and would end up raising her blood pressure. Even though she hadn't gone out to do anything wrong like people assumed the girls in Whispering Way Street go out to do at night, she didn't want her mother to hear of it. Furthermore, she was aware that Owen was only worried about her well-being, but sometimes he could get really demanding and annoying. I went out to sing at the bar in the uptown street to earn money to help Mother, she admitted. But I ended up being chased out of the bar without being paid. That man you saw last night is Professor Leo. He gave me a ride home when I couldn't find a cab. She said, leaving out the part of her almost being raped, as that would only make him pester her. Now that you've heard everything, I have to prepare for school. I'm running late. She said, and without giving him the chance to stop her or even speak, she hurried into the bathroom and slammed the door. Owen stared at the slammed door for a while. The man he'd seen last night looked nothing like a professor. His blue eyes shifted to the shattered guitar on the floor, and without another word, he left the room. Mia arrived at school in a rush. She was already a few minutes late for her morning class because she hadn't woken up on time and had been confronted by Owen. However, the moment she stepped into Ivy Grove Institute, she was surprised to see her picture along with Diane Foster and a few other students being posted in every corner of the university. Our participants of this year's Queen and King of Ivy Grove was written below each and every picture poster. Mia was too stunned to move. She stared at a picture of herself taken behind the school library. She hadn't even known her picture was taken, nor did she remember ever signing to join the school's event. Chapter 20 Participants. Though Mia was stunned to find her pictures around the school, she didn't have much time to go and tell whoever posted it to bring it down because she was late for her class. She ran down the school hall to attend her class while making a mental note to get Carlos later for taking her pictures. When Mia arrived at the classroom, another student was stepping out and Mr. Bennett was the one teaching. She cursed under her breath when his piercing gray eyes snapped towards her. He looked more professional today than he was last night. He was dressed in a black suit that emphasized his tall, imposing figure. However, he wasn't wearing a tie, nor was he wearing the suit jacket to complete that professional look. A few buttons on his button-up white shirt were even left unbuttoned, and if one looked closely, they could see his tattoos peeking out. His lazy gray eyes swept over her before he said, "Harrison, I can see you have the habit of always arriving late to my class. Get to your seat," he said nonchalantly. If it wasn't his fault that she arrived home late last night, he wouldn't have allowed her inside the class and would send her out. However, before Mia could even take any step forward to find a seat, the student who was walking out when she entered barged into the classroom. "The fuck, Mr. Bennett, I arrived late and you send me out, but Miss Plain Jane arrived late and you tell her to have a seat." "You must be fucking kidding me," said Alaric Blackwood, the school's popular boy, with good looks and a haughty attitude. He rarely attended school but always had good grades because of his family's influence. He was also Diane's ex-boyfriend. Alaric had arrived to the class a few minutes before Mia. However, Neil had snapped his fingers and ordered him to scram. He had wanted to argue and let the damn professor know who he was in school, but the young professor had looked into his eyes with that overwhelming gaze of his and said if he didn't get out, he would show him who the superior was. However, one thing Alaric wouldn't let happen was being chased out while a plain girl like Mia Harrison would be allowed in. Mia looked at the popular boy of Ivy Grove, who had never spoken to her before nor spared her any glance. He was glaring at Mr. Bennett as if he would hit him if he allowed her to sit down while he was thrown out. The classroom was suddenly filled with murmuring from the students. Alaric was here before Mia. It is unfair for Mr. Bennett to throw him out while allowing her to sit in class. Yeah, she doesn't even deserve to be attending classes after stealing Diane's story. I hope she loses her scholarship. Neil silenced the murmuring with just his eyes before he looked at the student glaring at him. His lips twitched in irritation as he stared at Alaric, unfazed by the student's daring behavior. If he wasn't in disguise of another person's identity, Neil thought, he would have long broken some bones this morning. Because one thing he disliked was when someone questioned his orders. With the corner of his lips pulled up, Neil challenged the student sarcastically, "Well, Mr. Blackwood, if you're so keen on staying in my class, feel free to take a seat. But let me warn you, you will only be taking a seat in my class with a broken limb." He turned to Mia and added, "Harrison, go ahead and find your seat." Mia did as she was told and gingerly walked towards the seat Rain was reserving for her beside her. Alaric's anger mounted by the plain Jane being allowed to sit. It seemed this new professor had no idea who he was on campus. Not to mention the professor was too young to command him around and believed he could do whatever he pleased in the class. Nonetheless, he decided to leave the class, not because the damn man ordered him to, but because he wanted to. He asserted the professor with a defiant look before exiting the room. "Whoa, that was unexpected," Rain exclaimed after they were done with the morning class and were heading outside. "For a moment there, I almost thought Alaric would fight Mr. Bennett." Mia couldn't help but laugh nervously at Rain's remarks. With the way Mr. Bennett had beaten up 8 men last night, she doubted Alaric was a match for him when it came to strength. She was still finding it hard to even believe Leo Bennett was qualified to be a professor with such temper and looks. However, she didn't mention her encounter with him last night to Rain as they headed to the shed behind the library. As they passed by the poster of the participants' pictures, Mia recalled she wanted her picture down. "Rain, can you believe that Carlos dared to add me to the participants of the year? I have told him to delete those pictures he took the other day, but it seems he went ahead and signed me in while also putting himself as my personal photographer for the event," Mia complained to her friend in displeasure. "Relax, Mia. Joining the contest won't kill you. I also think it's a good idea for you to be a part of it. Besides, you will gain a lot from it if you took part," remarked Rain as they sat down under the shed. She wouldn't have supported Carlos to add Mia if she didn't think her friend was beautiful enough to be a part of the contest. Mia scoffed, "If it's not going to add to my grades, then I don't want to be a part. I will go and remove my name from the participants later," she said. No, you won't. The contest might not add to your grades, but it will give you recognition in Zen City, because it will be a live show on the news channel. I even heard from the senior year students that the last contest, the winners were gifted with cars. If you know what's good for you, don't remove your name, Rain advised as she took out her tablet from her bag to show Mia the pictures of the cars gifted to the king and queen of the last contest. Mia looked at the brand new cars in disbelief. Though she knew Ivy Grove was the top one most expensive institution in the country, she hadn't expected them to spend this much on events that had nothing to do with academic activities. But then, most rich folks do like to spend money on unnecessary things. Mia was going to shrug and still insist on removing her name as she thought she had nothing to do with a car when she lived in a place like Whispering Way Street where it would be stolen right under her nose, even if she won by chance. However, remembering the loan warning document that she'd seen last night, she realized she could try her best to win the car, then sell it off to assist her mother. Before Mia could tell Rain her decision to participate, the devil's spawn and her lackeys approached them. It was Diane and her two friends. As usual, Diane Foster was overdressed as if she came to school to club instead of study. She catwalked towards them in her long high heels, with her pink dress swaying with the gentle wind, her blonde hair tied to the side of her head. When she stood before Mia and Rain, she looked down at them as if they were some ants she could step on. She crossed her arms against her chest and chuckled in amusement. "I can see you didn't heed my warnings, Miss Plain Jane. You didn't only go ahead to dare want to compete with me in the contest, you even purposely came late to Leo's class so he could notice you and take your side over Alaric's," she accused. To Diane, Mia had purposely came late so Leo could notice her, but what the Plain Jane didn't know was that she had marked the professor as hers. Even though Leo had walked out on her in the restaurant, she knew he would soon come back to her just like every other man she'd dated before. But she wouldn't sit still and let some plain, poor girl from the slums compete with her with the man she'd set her eyes on. She would break whoever tried to get her man. Mia exchanged glances with Rain before they both laughed out loud. "You are the most delusional person I have ever seen, Diane. First, you have no right to tell me not to join the contest, and second, you think every girl on earth is like you who throws herself at any dashing man that catches her attention. Go and rest your pretty face, because I have no energy to bark with you today." Diane's pretty face turned ugly by the insult. "You've got some loud mouth there, Plain Jane, but let me tell you something, it won't be for long. I will make your life a living hell in Ivy Grove. And stay the hell away from my man."